Welcome, everyone. We're going to talk this morning about test verification through REST, SOAP, SQL, and DLL. So I know that most of us use AscentialTest as primarily a tool for testing graphical user interfaces. But when it comes to verification, sometimes we need to verify outside of the GUI. And so that's really what I'm going to be concentrating on in this presentation. I'm going to be talking a little bit about JSON and Rest and XML and SOAP. We'll talk about DLL Calling and SQL. And then actually at the end of the presentation, as long as we have some time, I'm going to spend some time demonstrating some of the recent features in 9.7. Customer suggested that would be a good thing to do during these webinars. So I'll try to save some time for that. I'm going to jump right into JSON and Rest. So we have some new classes in AscentialTest for JSON and Rest, and you'll find that there's something called a JSON array, there's a JSON object, and a Rest class. The JSON array class is for parsing and manipulating JSON arrays. Likewise, the JSON object is for parsing and manipulating a JSON object, and we'll be looking at arrays and objects in a few minutes. And then the REST class is for communicating with the REST server. Just to give you an idea of the types of actions that are available in these classes, we'll take a look at the JSON class, the object class actually. And so here's just a little graphic from the Actions Explorer of AscentialTest. And you can see that there are some actions in this class that will operate on the entire JSON object. Things like appending to a JSON object, clearing it, counting the number of members, omitting a file, omitting a string, checking to see if it has a member. And then there are other actions that operate on specific nodes. And you'll notice that nodes can be located either by their tag or their name or by their relative location. So you're going to see a pattern. You can delete, or you and this is where you would name the member. Here you would say delete at, so you would give it an index. And again, you'll see this pattern repeat. You can get, or you can get at, name, name at, rename, rename at, and so forth. So you see this pattern. And so when you look at the names of the different actions, you can pretty much tell what they do just by looking at the actions. And you can see that it really meant to be manipulating a piece of JSON. And I just want to put one up here just real quick. So here's an example of a file. This is just a notepad file that's got some JSON on it, just so that you can see. It opens with a curly. We've got a member name bool, set it to false, a member name integer, and so forth. And we're going to be dealing with examples like this in AscentialTest as I go through and explain how it works. So let's take a quick look at an example, and then I'm going to bring up AscentialTest and we'll look at one live. But here is a step called JSON object test step. And you can see what the JSON actions look like. So here I'm defining a JSON object. So just like defining any other variable, you know, like when you say string, my name, or whatever, it's the same idea. So you've got a class and an instance of the class. And then we're going to start to append to that particular object. So I'm appending a field called B and I'm setting it to false, a field called I, and these names are not significant. You know, I did name B for Boolean and I for integer, but they're not significant, they're just names. And then here in this example, you can see that, you know, after I set a Boolean, an integer, a real, and a string, if I want to set another object as part of this object, I can instantiate a new one just by saying new. And then I'm instantiating a new object with X and Y. Again, I'm going to run this for you in a minute so you can see what it looks like. And here's an array. I guess the difference between an array is you see the square brackets here. So we're instantiating a new array inside of this JSON object. And we're emitting the string, and then I'm going to set some values. And you can see set. Here I'm setting by the name. So when I say set, I find the member and I change blue to green. And here I'm setting O.x, which is this value here. I'm changing it from 4 to 44. And then in the array, I'm changing the last value in the array to 33. So let's look at this example live, and then we can talk about it. Okay, so here I am in AscentialTest, and we see that same example that I just looked at. And I'll run it for you. So when I run it, you can see that I did create a new JSON object. I set B to false, and you can see in the results here how I was setting it. And notice the difference between the simple values like Booleans. Here's another object right here. So you see that expands and collapses. So here's my object O and my fields X and Y. And then there's my array, and you can see the square brackets in the array, and I set the values to 1, 2, and 3. Now the bottom part is what I did to manipulate the object after I created it. So like I was saying earlier, you can see that I found S, which was originally blue, and here's the member S, and I set it to green. And then I found the object O.x, and I set it to 44. And finally the array, by index, I changed the value from 3 to 33. So you can see it's pretty easy to manipulate a JSON object, and in this case we're using the names of the members in order to find them and change them. Let me just check my notes here for a second. Got to get that panel out of the way. I've got the panel up. And by the way, I know we're going to take questions at the end, so you can fire questions at that panel there, and then I'll take them up, at the end. So a couple things I want to point out about this example, because there's kind of a lot going on here. You'll notice that I can set members to various types, first of all. So it knows, a Boolean from an integer to a real to a string. You notice that I can emit, which would be to print something. And you notice that I was able to modify. Now, if we look at this next example, it's pretty similar, but the difference is when I went to modify, instead of doing a set by finding the values, I did a set at. So I'm finding it by its relative position. So let's run this and see what happens. So when I run it, you'll notice here I set at 3. So it's the 1, 2, 3. It's the third, and you can see that I changed 3.14 to 99.1. And the same thing with the set at and the object here. So remember, if we think back on that slide where I talked about how most of the actions that will manipulate the JSON object can be done through the member name or the relative position. And that's what you're seeing there. Now, if you have a JSON file, the way that you can get that file into an object is by using load file. So if we take this file here, that I showed you, and we just load it in and then print it, that's how you can get a file, because that's often how you're going to get your JSON, how you can get a file into a JSON object so that you can emit it. So that's how I emitted the string. So you can manipulate it, you can emit it to a string, or you can emit it back to a file. So you can, just like we're emitting a string here, you can actually emit it to a file as well. Now let's take a look at the Actions Explorer here so that you can see where all these are. So here again, we have these classes, and you can see the JSON object. That's the class that we've been dealing with so far. And you see, like right next to the emit string, here's the emit file. So if you wanted to write your JSON to a file, you can do that with emit file. Now, if we were to compare to JSON array, you'd see that there's a lot of the methods are the same. There's a lot of similarity between the two. There's more in the JSON object. The JSON array is a little bit limited, but it's the same idea. But instead of manipulating an object, you're manipulating an array. And you got a chance to see what an array looked like just a few minutes ago. Now, what do you use this for? Well, a lot of times what you're doing is you're communicating with a REST server. And so I have an example for you here that we're going to talk about. And when you're communicating with a server, and I should say I'm not an expert in JSON. In fact, I only started to learn it when we started to support it. But I'm picking up a few things just by helping all of you using our new REST class. See that, most of the time what we're doing is we're wanting to send a request to a server. So we might do a get, we might do a post, we might do a put, we might do a delete, that sort of thing. And so here, and this is a real live example, this goes against our Jira instance, because Xenix uses Jira. And so if you look at this request here, we're actually going to call the server. I'm going to run this for you in a moment. And we're going to get, in this case, we're going to get something from our REST server, and then I'm going to be able to count the nodes. I can get one of the fields and show you what that looks like. And so typically, this is the typical scenario. We're going to set the authorization. So we're basically going to identify ourselves. We're going to connect. And then we're going to actually make a request. And again, that could be a get or a post or a put or something like that. And that's what's specified here. And then here is the server itself. So we're specifying, well, here's the server and here's the request. So let's go ahead and run that for you. Okay, whoops, I'm in the wrong place. I've got to call it here because I purposely hid somebody's password in the other example. So I'm calling it instead from here, because it was one of our developers' passwords that I didn't want exposed to the world here. So you can see I made that request, and this is the exact call that I made, by the way. I just called it from inside of a test. And you can see the rest that came, the JSON that came back. And so, this looks a little different than my little examples that I was showing you before, but not really. It's just ID, key, name, and so forth. You can see all the fields there. So we got back the result of that call, which is pretty large. And then if you look at the bottom, you remember I counted, I found a node, and then I indexed in order to get a particular value there. And that was what I was doing here on the bottom. So I got that node, and then I got projects 1, so it's an array, and then I got that particular value. So there isn't really anything difficult about dealing with JSON, especially if you're already familiar with Rest, but you'll find that the actual manipulation, that I think the methods are pretty clear and they're pretty easy to use. And of course, we have documentation here on all the classes. I'm actually going to be adding a couple of examples because I was helping a customer just the other day and found that we need some, I think, more complex examples because there's, some very basic examples here. But as I'm developing a better understanding, I'm seeing that these examples that we have could be a little bit more complex. So we'll add some more examples in the next release of AscentialTest. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about SOAP. And with SOAP, we're dealing with XML. And those of you that have been using AscentialTest know that in a way we already support XML, but it's not part of Zee yet. We wrote it when we were consultants for a project, and we encapsulated the actions inside of a DLL. And so in AscentialTest, what we do right now is we provide you with this star XML.DLL. You've already got it on your machines. If you've never used it, you might not have ever noticed that it was there, but it's always been there. And in the support folder, so if you went to your AscentialTest installation and you went to your support folder, then you would find this star XML.Z file. And in that file, basically what we've done is we've declared all of the C functions using DLL calling, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But we did implement it as a DLL, so you've got that DLL. And then what we did was we wrapped everything in Zee so that it would be very easy for you to use. So we've already got all of the Zee equivalents of what's inside of that DLL, all the published methods. And if you look at my Actions Explorer, this will be different than yours because if you haven't pulled that Zee file in, you won't see it. But if you look in mine, you'll see, ignore the ones in C right now because those are showing up just because they're in the file. You won't use those. You're going to use these here. So these are all the ones that we wrapped. Now they're not documented yet, but they can all be, dragged and dropped just like anything else. But what we're doing in the next release is we're actually replacing these. So they won't go away. If you're using them, don't worry about it. We'll continue to support it. But we're going to be developing something that matches more like the style that you see here with the JSON. So there'll be an XML class. And we're going to try to the extent that we can, because as you know, XML and JSON are similar, but they're not exactly the same. But to the extent that we can, we'll try to keep some symmetry between the JSON object and the XML class. But for now, until that's released, that we are planning on that as part of AscentialTest 9.8. So the next release, we should have the XML stuff in there. But in the meantime, you can use the library that I just showed you. And again, now you know where it lives. It's in the support folder of your AscentialTest installation. So if I go there, I can show you. So here's my AscentialTest installation. And if I go to the folder called support, I'll see the star XML.Z. And I can just simply come here to my project library and say add existing Z file and just pull that file right into my project. That's how I got it into my project. And you can see it right here. So you can do this today. You don't need anything from us to do that. The DLL itself isn't really anything that you need to worry about. It is there though. You will find, and again, it's been there all along. If you weren't interested in it, you would just never have noticed it. Excuse me, I'm gonna sip some water. And we've got there's the star XML DLL right there. So I've got a little example here for you just so you can see how you can use it, and I'll run it for you. And I'd say it's kind of similar to JSON here. I'm loading up an XML file, and then I'm just getting the elements. I think I might have that XML file open here because I'm actually going to use it as an example for you. So here's the file itself right here. And you can see that what I'm doing is I'm getting note 2 and I'm getting the value. And if we pull that aside, you'll see here's the value loop. And I'm getting the note from, and there's Xenex and so forth. And then I'm going to get the LM contents of this node here, and I'm going to get the whole thing. So you can see all of the different elements and their values. So again, like JSON, it's not hard to do. It's actually quite easy to do once you become familiar. I think the hardest thing right now is that we have not documented these because they're not really part of the product. But after 9.8, when we develop the new library, they'll be documented just like they are for JSON, and it'll show up under classes here. You'll see a new XML class. Now what I want to do is let me just go back here and make sure that I didn't forget to tell you something. I pretty much told you everything that's in the slide there. But again, you can see this is what it looks like in my Project Explorer. And here's some examples of operating on the entire object, so you can create an XML. That's getting a handle to it. You can load it from a file. You can get the text of an element. You can set the text of an element. You can get all the contents of an element, so that would be like sort of recursively going down and getting the entire path. And you can set an entire path. You can create and delete an element. Again, like with JSON, I think the names suggest what they do. Now, if you had a web service right now, even though we don't have a SOAP class, what we found was, quite by accident, that the full request and the other methods that support the full request in the REST class actually will support SOAP and XML as well. Because really what this does is it just sends a request to a server. It doesn't really matter what kind it is. So it will work for SOAP or for a web service where you're passing it something other than JSON. Now, when we get to 9.8, we've got to resolve any confusion that might be caused by this. So we haven't figured that out yet, but we'll get the naming right so that it makes sense to you. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about DLL calling. Now this is not new in AscentialTest. I believe this has been here right from the very beginning when AscentialTest first came out. And a lot of people don't know you can do this, and this could be very useful to you. You can declare a DLL in Zee, and I'm going to show you an example of that. And any methods that are public in that DLL can be called. Now you do have to get familiar with new Zee types for passing parameters, and I'll show you why in a moment. So this is what it would look like, and we're going to look at it live in a few minutes. So you see there's a keyword in Zee called DLL, and you name the DLL. I'm going to use user32.dll, and I'm going to demonstrate a method called moveWindow, and I'll run it for you. But you'll see I actually needed this in a case because I needed to move something out of the way in sort of a crude way. And so I found that moveWindow will do just that. I was able to get the handle of it from AscentialTest, and I was able to move it and change its size to get it out of the way when I needed to do that. But what I was talking about earlier was, you'll notice that we've got some types that we put into Zee just for passing to C, because that's what you're doing when you call a DLL. So you know how in AscentialTest we have Boolean, string, and so forth. Well, you know, in C we've got bool and char and so forth. So we needed to create types inside of Zee so that we would be able to pass the parameters over to those methods that are published inside the DLL. And so there's a help page in here that gives you the mapping, if you will. So if you're going to be calling DLLs that take parameters, you're going to need to get familiar with this. So let's take a look at a real example. Let me show you the DLL first. Now, there's a lot more in user32.dll than what I needed, but since I only needed move, that's all I did was specify the prototype for move. So you can see it passes back a Boolean, whether it was successful or not. It takes a handle, the X and Y location that you want to move it to. If you want to change the width, the height, you pass that. And then this causes it to repaint if you pass it true so that you can actually see the result. And then this here is what I'm going to call it in Zee. In this case, I don't have any conflict in Zee because we don't have something called move window. So I just called it move window. But that's why we have this alias here, because let's say that there was something inside of a DLL and it was named the same thing that we already had in Zee. Well, then there'd be a name conflict. So you would have to name it something other than a reserved name that was already used inside of Zee in AscentialTest. So let's have a look at the example. So, you know, here is where I'm declaring the DLL. I'm naming it move window. I didn't wrap it like I did with this stuff here. We decided to wrap all of these to make them easier for you to use. So in this case, with the actions that were here, instead of calling them directly, we wrap them all inside of some Zee to make it easier. But here, I'm just going to call it directly. And so we go here, and you'll see I've declared the object inside of AscentialTest, and it was, I'll show it to you. It's just this here. So I actually created an application profile for Notepad, and I declared this object. So it's got a name, it's got an app object name, and I'm getting its handle. So I'm using getAttribute to get the win handle. There's the handle, and I need that because remember the DLL, the first thing it wants is a handle to the window. And then I'm going to move it to 1010, and I'm going to size it as 500, and I'm going to repaint it. And so you'll see if I come here and I run this, oops, hang on one second, let me just get this out of the way so you can see it. I'll do it again. It did it anyway. Didn't matter that I was covering it, but I want you to see it. So if I run it, you see that it moved the window. And I think if I can resize it for you, I'll go like that and run it. And you see that it not only moved it, but it also resized it. So again, that's a good thing to know, that you can use. There's a lot of useful things in some of the Windows DLLs that we don't support inside of AscentialTest, or sometimes maybe something, you know, is custom and it wasn't working in AscentialTest. You can use the user32.dll. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before I start demoing some new features is I want to talk about SQL. Now, a lot of you might be familiar with this one because unlike the JSON and the XML and the DLLs, I think a lot of folks use the ODBC driver that's built into AscentialTest, but not everyone does, so I want to introduce it. This is very useful for verification, among other things, but I think a lot of us use it for verification. So, for example, if I have an application where I'm going to be updating a database, putting in maybe new accounts, new users, changing data, I can verify through the graphical user interface, yes, but I might also want to verify the database to make sure that the commit actually happened or the update actually happened. And so one way to do that would be to use our database class. And so, as I said, we have an ODBC driver built into Zee. We have a class called database, and you'll see it in the Actions Explorer. And it has a number of actions like connect, disconnect, execute. There's a bunch of different fetches depending on the shape of the object that you want to fetch into. If you're just going to fetch it into a variable, then you just use fetch. If you want to fetch to a list, fetch to list, or fetch to record. Now, there's some kind of esoteric things in the class as well that we don't really use very often, but if you wanted to say, for example, get all the column names of your table, you can get it. You can tell whether you're connected and so forth. But I think primarily what we use is connect, disconnect, execute, and then one of the fetches. Pretty typical, I think. And so I have an example here. This is a real example. I can run it for you. It's actually going to go out to our database here for this demo application. And you can see that I've dragged over the database class. I just did it from here. I just dragged it over. I dragged over the connect. It created a handle to the database. I put in the connect string. Connect strings for some databases are kind of easy, like for SQL Anywhere, Microsoft SQL Server, or they can be tricky if you're like using Oracle. But if you're using Oracle and you have any issues, please let us know in support, because we've had some customers that have had Oracle and we've learned how to assist them, so we can send you something that will make it a lot easier for you to come up with your connect string for an Oracle database. Now I have a very simple SQL statement here. It helps to know SQL, of course, if you're going to be executing SQL. I'm selecting everything in this row from a table called sales order where the ID equals 2685, and I decided to fetch it to a record. So you can see here that I've got a record that I've made to be the same shape as the table that I'm getting it from. And so if we want to look at my type, you can see I have a type. I have a record called sales order. So it has an ID, a cust ID, an order date, and so forth. This matches the record in the database that I'm fetching, because I'm fetching the whole row. So I'm going to fetch it into a record, and then I'll print the record, and that's what I did when I ran it for you. So I fetched it into a record, and then I printed the record, and here it is. Or in this case, I didn't want the whole record, I just wanted cust ID. So I'm just getting that one column. And so notice here, I don't fetch to record, I just do a regular fetch. And then I print the value. It's a good idea to disconnect from the database, because I think if you left that connection open and then you tried to connect again, you might have a problem. When a test is over, it would happen anyway, but if you're in another step in a test, that disconnect would not have happened if you're inside of another step inside your test. So good idea to disconnect. Okay, and we've got about 20 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes before Q&A time. So let me talk a little bit about the most recent release. Got the release notes here. And by the way, I will take questions on what I presented and then also on the new release in just a few minutes. So if we look at 9.7, probably my favorite new feature is that steps and tests can now be edited in full Z mode. And I'm going to demonstrate this one for you in just a couple of minutes. You know that before you used to be able to put a single line in Z mode, but now you can put the entire step or entire test in Z mode. This is my other favorite feature. Primary app objects are really, really useful in terms of being able to locate snapshots, but most people, including me, would always forget to create their primary app object. But now we not only create them for you, but we rename them as well when you rename your objects. So I'll demonstrate that for you too. Other features, if you're a Power Builder user, there's a lot of new support for Power Builder. And you'll notice, some of you might have noticed, that you had to upgrade AscentialTest if you were testing Power Builder 2019 R3. And the reason for that is that the Appian completely restructured on the file, on the disk, where everything is located. That kind of separated things. So, and they've also changed the names of their DLLs so that they're no longer version specific. So we had to make some changes in order to support that. So we're supporting Power Builder 2019 R3. We're supporting Power Client 2019 R3. And then we got a preview of the new Power Server 2021, and we're supporting that already as well. You may have noticed that there were certain actions in AscentialTest that you were never able to use the auto parameterization for, like select path and set password and type command, type keys, and so forth. So you can now, if you go up and do add parameters and you have these actions selected, you'll notice now that you get an auto parameter for these methods. We went through all the methods and found, the ones that were missing and what made sense. We also added a couple of new methods. I've helped a lot of people over the years with select from context menu and select from pop-up menu, and most of the reason why folks sometimes needed help was they were not draggable and droppable. You had to do some typing, and it was kind of weird. You had to type the object that you wanted to click on with the right click or the left click, and then you'd have to say dot, open square bracket, menu item, blah, blah, blah. So instead what we did was we just made actions, and now they're draggable and droppable. Much, much easier to use. Folks that were using WPF missed the all button before. Well, the all button is there now. So when you get your new snapshot and you want to drag over the whole form, you can do that. Someone pointed out, actually Pete, I don't know if you're with us this morning, but Pete pointed out that when you copied a step or copied a test, it didn't open the copy. And that did make a whole lot more sense. So now when you do copy step, copy test, the copy gets open, the thing that you want to modify. We also added some key equivalents to the Project Explorer. So now you can do plus or minus to open and close nodes. Run arguments is now fully working. Run arguments always had some issues with optional parameters. So that is now working completely, and all the optional parameters now display, and you can modify them. So if you're in your step and you're debugging and you want to mess with the arguments, you'll find that that works a whole lot better. This is interesting. We have a new action called app enable. And what app enable does is it allows you at runtime to hook and unhook extensions. This came about with a couple of customers that had some issues. We had one customer that had an application that kind of went into a bad state, I would say. We were not able to communicate with it while it invoked another module or another application. And so what we really needed to do was be able to disconnect from that other application so that we can communicate with the active one and then reconnect to it. And we did have a way to kind of hack around that, but it wasn't elegant. So we came up with this new way where you can just app enable. In fact, if you call app enable and you don't give it any extensions to hook, it'll just unhook everything. And then you can call it again and you can rehook. It could also get you into, out of some jams. We had another situation where because we were hooked into an application, it wasn't allowed to let go of its, I think it was its GDI objects. And so by calling app enable and unhooking it, it was able to let go of all of its objects and then able to just rehook it again and keep going. So like you could put that in, for example, in your on finish, and you can unhook and hook your application again. Let's see. Oh, we also put in a delay load for Power Builder because we found that with some applications, it was a little bit of a lag in being able to communicate with the application. So you probably wouldn't be doing this unless you called support and we told you to put that in. We also added build number to your test set reports. That was another request from a customer. So if you use build number, it will show up on your test set reports. If you don't, then the field won't show up at all. We'll suppress it. Also found some bugs that we fixed. Most of these were reported. Some of them we found ourselves. This was reported from someone where we were calling get parent on an app object. It was actually changing the value. So if you called it several times, you kept getting a different parent. It was kind of walking up the tree. So that's been resolved. We found some translation issues where we had some truncation for French, I think it was, or Spanish. Those have been resolved. I don't know why nobody reported this. I found that class mappings were not being saved. So if you had old ones, they were fine, but if you made new ones, they weren't being saved. That got broken when we created the new wizard that created your extensions for you. So that's been resolved. Someone found some old references to the old name of AscentialTest. We fixed those. We found we had to add a hook retry interval for the later versions of Firefox. So that's being made for you automatically now. You don't have to think about it. If you were using IE, and I know it's getting old, but some people are still using IE, and you're using IE in different languages, we found that we were not able to find the location field, the URL field. So we've now added a language independent path so that that won't happen anymore. It actually made it seem like we weren't hooked into the browser, but it turns out that wasn't true at all. We just weren't able to find the URL field. And then you might have seen an issue with your merge command line and your for version control with subversion, and so that's been resolved as well. And then a lot of people got stung by this one over the years. You can't click on a menu item because it's not a real object in Windows. You have to use select. But the error message that we raised was not very clear, so we cleaned up that error message to tell you you're using click and you can't use click on a menu item. Use select instead. So that'll save you from having to contact support. We have gotten to the bottom of an issue in the most recent versions of Appian Power Builder when UI themes is being used. What happens is there's a bug that Appian has acknowledged. When you use UI themes, it reports back to AscentialTest that there's not a scroll bar on the data window when there is. So if you're using UI themes, you might be seeing issues with scrolling. It doesn't affect scrolling if you're using a string selector, but if you were trying to use an index or if you were using render text or something like that because you had some issues, you might have run into some problems. I did get confirmation from Appian that this is going to be fixed in their June patch, so it's coming quite soon. So that will be resolved. If you're using UI themes, you won't be having that problem anymore. Now let me demonstrate a couple of new features for you. Again, I think I told you what my two favorite features are in 9.7. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate those for you now. So one thing you'll notice here now, I've got this object, I've got my find dialog, and in the past, I had to update this I had to update it manually. So if I'm going to drag this over, you'll notice now that you don't have to worry about this. It's automatically taken care of for you, so that when you come over to the snapshot panel, you won't find unassigned. I mean, unassigned is still there for those snapshots that you haven't dragged anything over, but now I don't have to worry about it. So if I need to locate my snapshot, I can just come right over here and click, because I know I want find. I can find it by its name, and then it will locate it for you. And likewise, if I come here and I decide that I want to rename it, so we'll just call it find X. AscentialTest is going to rename it for you as well. So you see it's renamed. So I find that now that the primary app object is managed for us automatically, we don't have a lot of mess with our snapshot panel where we get frustrated, we can't find the snapshot, we take another one, and then sooner or later we've got like hundreds or thousands of snapshots in our project because we can't look here and try to find them all because it's too hard. But now you can just locate them by name. And so it should keep your projects a whole lot cleaner. Now, another new feature that I like a lot, you'll notice here in your toolbar that, we know in the past we were always able to put a particular line into Z mode just by clicking on the Z. It was like a toggle. But now you can put the whole step into Z mode. So it's kind of similar to being in the in the library, but if you work in the library, you don't have an Actions Explorer, you don't have an Actions panel, you do have IntelliSense, but you miss a lot of the drag and drop features of AscentialTest, whereas now, if you do want to script, you can do that freely. It's the same editor that you get inside of the library, but you still have the ability to drag and drop from here, to drag and drop from there. You've still got your IntelliSense. So to me, it's kind of like the best of both worlds. I can script when I want to script. I can still even drag over my if statements and so forth because I find that faster sometimes than typing. And if I decide, I want to go back, I can just click on the Z. It's a toggle, just like the little Z mode, just to go back and forth. So those are my two favorite features in 9.7. Okay, now I want to turn it over to you to see if you have any questions. And Sandra, I'm not so accustomed to this panel. I don't see any questions in the panel. Does anyone have any questions?
For the moment, we don't have questions. So I remind you that you can use the question pane in your control panel.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions about anything I've presented or any question at all, it's fine. We've got a few minutes left. If anybody has anything that they want to ask. I don't see any. Okay, well, we're already hard at work on 9.8, and I know some of you were disappointed that the breakpoint didn't make 9.7, but it will make 9.08. We're almost finished with it. I've been testing it, and so far what's been implemented is working well. And so 9.8 will be out sometime this summer. It's going to include, as I mentioned already, it's going to include the new XML class. It will have the breakpoint. It's got a number of new features. Possibly we'll get into that one. I'm not positive yet, but we're going to have integration with Git. We do have the Azure. We have the Azure plugin almost working. So if you're familiar with our Jenkins plugin, that was completed last fall. The Azure one is almost there, and that doesn't require a release of AscentialTest. It'll just be published in the Azure store, and that should be available pretty soon. Do we have a question now?
Yes, we have 3 questions. About the database, does the app under test have to disconnect?
No, it does not. No, it does not need to disconnect from the database. So the application can be running and connected from the database. I mean, that would only be true if, I think, if your developers made some sort of an error in the way that they lock the database. But no, typically that would not be true. Okay. And in most cases, you're just getting anyway. But you can even update the database. Now that would be up to the way, again, your developers have developed the database. But certainly for getting, I wouldn't expect there to be any issues there.
Okay. And when I have a doubt on REST, how to connect to the server?
I'm sorry, say that again, Sandra?
I have a doubt on REST, how to connect to the server.
A question on how to connect to the server? Sure.
Yeah, about
okay.
REST.
Let me go to that example again. Bear with me a moment. Let me get out of this mode so I've got a little bit of room. And I'll bring up the... Okay, so here's the example again of connecting to a REST server. Now, if you've experienced some issues, you should contact support so that we can help you through. We do have a customer that has been extensively using this now. So just in the last couple of weeks, I've gotten a lot more opportunity to get into this myself because I've been helping them and learning a little bit more about JSON and about how to connect. But we haven't had any connection problems once we learned the sequence that you have to set your auth, do your connect, make your request. So if you follow the chain of command here and do this in order, you shouldn't have any issues. Again, if you are, please contact us so that we can help you with your specific example. But if you follow this, you should have success.
So last question, what about the DPI independence?
Oh yeah, good question. Some of you know that we started working on that. And I do have that scheduled right now for 9.8. We ran into a whole bunch of snags when we started working on it last time. We had it working for Chrome completely. It worked beautifully for some applications because you might be aware that there's something called DPI awareness. And some applications behave better when you say, for example, when you change your DPI, they automatically convert to the new DPI, and other ones don't. So we are still planning to get DPI independence working, but like I say, we ran into so many snags last time that we had to pull it out last minute. But it is scheduled, so hopefully we will be able to get that next time. I know the pain that can come from working on a very small laptop, because one of the laptops that we have here in the lab, the one that I take around when I actually go make presentations, is a mini. And even with my glasses on, I have a hard time seeing at 100%. But in order to actually get something to run, I have to be at 100%. Now, what I've learned to do on this machine is I take all my snapshots, and then I convert back over to, the recommended display to do all my work in AscentialTest. But then I have to remember to switch back over to 100% in order to actually run the test, because otherwise AscentialTest won't see the objects. Oddly, I've found it works okay. Again, you can experiment. With some applications, it works okay. Like I think with Power Builder, sometimes I've seen it work okay. But again, we do still plan on doing that, and I hope we can get it in for the next release. Thanks for asking.